Welcome everybody again. Sorry for the blunder on the first time. I would take full responsibility for that. We are Axioms on Trial, and by we I mean me and Cease to Know, as well as Max and Wes, who are not with us, but they will be in future episodes. We're going to just kind of kick it off pretty simply and just go straight into it. David is a theist. He's been on the Atheist Roundtable before. We've had some conversations over there. He's had conversations with Cease on the Atheist Roundtable. And we've had conversations before that on the internet. So we're all pretty chummy. We're pretty good friends, I feel like, at this point. But I'm going to kick it off to Cease. I might come in and ask some questions towards the end, but I really wanted to kind of see you guys have a conversation and make it a one-on-one. But Cease, kick it off to you and however you want to go into that.
Sure. Well, thanks everyone for listening. Hey, Dave. I actually don't know that we have talked this way before. I think we saw each other in passing on the Atheist Roundtable.
Yeah, that was when you had David, the other David, the quantum physicist guy. Yeah.
By the way, he's the guest in the first episode, so everyone check that out if you're interested. But yeah, so I guess I'll sort of go back into what I was saying earlier before we had all the technical issues. What I'm interested in right now is sort of a general bit of background from your perspective, how it is that you came to the beliefs you have. And then we can sort of go back and forth a little bit. And in the future, we had some ideas for debates that we could have. Like I wanted to debate on the resurrection with you and some other issues, and maybe go into more details to some of our disagreements. And I'll say what I said earlier again. I want to give you credit. Because unlike a lot of people that I've seen on TikTok and other platforms, I do think that you're, genuinely interested in conversations. A lot of what I see from other people are, praying at a gas station and, with cheesy music in the background, trying to get attention and sell merchandise. And I think that's very disingenuous. And, instead I see you actually engaging with people. That said, I think you were entirely wrong in your approach to these questions. And so what you think is rational, I think is irrational and vice versa. So one of us is clearly wrong in our approach to how we understand reality. And what I want to figure out is which one of us that is. And so, I appreciate you being here and I appreciate your time. And let's just get into it. Why don't you tell me a little bit of your background and about your testimony, and then we can go from there.
Sure. Yeah, no, I'll try and keep this a little bit shorter since I kind of started. So about me, I'm a pretty average person. I'm not like most typical other guys. I don't really care for like sports or anything, but I do go to the gym and I like music and video games. So, those are probably the closest guy things that I really do. Other than that, I don't really do much else. I don't really care to do much. I'm a pretty simple person. As far as my testimony goes, we can maybe break down the details, but I'm just going to kind of try and make it a condensed version. But when we talk about a testimony, I think often people give what initially brought them to God. And then from there, I think that it kind of unfolds as a story, so to speak. I mentioned that, I recently heard in a conversation by, it was Michael and some other, I don't remember who the person was, but Michael said something that was very interesting that I kind of agree with him in some respects, which is that when we're talking about evidence for God, I think that it kind of runs similarly to a testimony. When we're talking about evidence that constitutes God's existence, I don't think it's just one thing. I think it's a combination of different things all meshing together to make one coherent thing. And with my faith, I think it's kind of similar. I've gone through, a lot of experiences that I said that I think, in the stereotype of things, most people who said, well, I wasn't a Christian, I'm an atheist, and the reason why I left the faith is because of this thing that happened in my life. I've had a lot of things happen in my life, from, my sister dying of cancer, where people came over and even prayed for her, where she obviously, she wasn't healed. I've gone through just a lot of rough times as growing up, kind of being someone who never really fit in anywhere. going through a divorce right now, and then going through a really rough time in the military, where, and I'm okay with saying this, but I just hated living, and I just wanted to die. But I think that in every single one of those instances, God was teaching me something, but my faith, first and foremost, starts at what is called the gospel. And for those who may not know, the gospel is essentially the following. The gospel is actually, I think it's Greek for good news, is how it translates. And the good news, of course, is that, as the Bible says, we're all sinful, which means that there's a standard that God has that we've all fallen short of. And we can't make ourselves on our own merit right with God. And so Jesus came to earth, lived the perfect life in our place, died the death that we deserved, and he lived that for us. And all you need to do to have that relationship with God restored is by repenting of your sin, which is just a fancy word for saying the change of mind, meaning that you recognize that, you recognize your conscience that's telling you that some of your decisions aren't right, and that it's pointing you to that standard of moral perfection that you haven't reached. And you change your mind about that, and then in faith in what Jesus did, you place your faith in that, and that is basically what restores your relationship with God. I believe that's what I've done, and it may have happened in one instance. It may have happened throughout the course of different instances in my life, but that is what I would say that my testimony is with regards to my faith. So
thank you for sharing that, and I can relate to at least some of those situations, having gone through a lot of difficult times myself. And I think what I would say is that I think our core disagreement is on what constitutes evidence. So one thing that I think I've seen you claim in your videos, that one, you know God exists, and that that atheists know that God exists, but that they reject God out of a desire to be not morally culpable for their actions. I've seen you say things of that sort. I mean, you can correct me if I'm misinterpreting you, but that was the message that I gathered from what you were saying.
In a sense, yes. There's a little bit more in it, but I've also said, it's a complicated thing, and actually, it's funny. I just watched a video on this, but it's that I think at some point everyone has recognized that a God has to exist, but instead of looking into that, they suppressed that and they pushed it away because it sounded ridiculous to them. So what I'm not saying is that I don't believe. It's not that I think that people have had direct knowledge of God in the same sense that you would have direct knowledge of like a result from a science experiment, for example. But based on what God is, I think that everyone has had what I at least could consider to be some kind of experience, and maybe they just didn't know how to approach it or what to do with it or how to look into it. And so instead of looking further into it, they just kind of pushed it away or off to the side. From that perspective, I would say I think that everyone has, and I don't have the exact study, but if you wanted, I could. There's even some psychological studies that show basically, that our brains are basically naturally wired to accept and believe in a God. And I think that that's something that you would expect to find in a world where, God wants you to believe in him for certain reasons. So
I'll say a few things. I think it's also what you would expect to find in a world where people are afraid of death and afraid of taking charge of their life. I can't speak for anybody else. I can only speak for myself as an atheist.
Sure.
And I can assure you that my journey has had nothing to do with sort of a desire to not be held morally accountable for things that I think I've done wrong. I can 100% recognize the fact that I'm an imperfect person, that I've made mistakes and I've hurt people, and there are things that I definitely want to change about myself, have changed, need to change. But none of that requires taking any assumptions without sufficient evidence. And I think that's, to me, we were talking about hard times earlier. There have been many times in my life where the comfort of belief in an all-loving creator that has my back would have helped me tremendously. And it wasn't a choice that I made to not be convinced by this concept. It wasn't that, internally, I don't want God to exist, therefore I reject the idea to benefit myself. Maybe some people might do that, but that's not my story. My situation is pretty simple. So I've looked at the evidence, I've looked at the arguments, and I see no rational reason, philosophically speaking, scientifically speaking, to accept the claim. Now, my mind could be changed with new evidence that comes in, or a new argument that I haven't heard before. I've never claimed to know anything with certainty. But so far, the arguments for God's necessity, as you've expressed it, I think have fallen, so short and have failed so miserably in light of what I have learned and understood in philosophy. And so, any of us can play the, psychoanalyst, right? Like, you can have that approach and say, well, atheists really know and have had an experience, but they're sort of denying themselves. And I can say, well, from your perspective, I think it's wishful thinking, that you want something to be true because it brings you meaning in your life, and it brings you a sense of direction and a sense of purpose. And therefore, from my perspective, you're sort of you're working backwards. You have the idea that you want to be true, and then you look at the world and try to sort of recontextualize observations to fit, to claim it's evidence when I think it's not. But what I want to try to do is try to avoid either of us making assumptions about the other person and their psychology. Because I think ultimately that we could be right or wrong about that, but it's, how would we prove it either way? I don't think it's helpful. So what I want to ask you is, in the context of arguments, what is the evidence that you would say leads to the necessity of God? Provide me this evidence.
So like I said, it's a mixture of different things. But I think it first helps to understand what we're talking about. So and this is something that I kind of gave an overview, but I'm sure that based on what you've maybe looked into, if you have, or maybe what you've heard, that we as human beings are very complicated creatures, and given how studies show how we can basically go about essentially, I don't know if tricking ourselves is the right word, but thinking that we're making the right decisions, ignoring evidence, that's something that could go either way. So it's not that I'm trying to psychoanalyze people. It's just that based on my worldview, and based on what the Bible calls sin, I can see that. And I'm sure that, I know that from your perspective, you can probably see the same thing too, but then it comes back then to what is God? I mean, I think that at least as a starting point, we should probably try and figure out, or at least give some kind of description for what we're talking about. Because I would fully disagree that Christianity, even from its inception, is something that's just made up. I looked this up because I heard this the other day, that you can't make something up that you have no knowledge of. And when you look at historical, like old historical documents, like from people from so long ago, a lot of people were not only talking about God, but were specifically reporting walking alongside this thing, whatever this thing was. And even up to this isn't just the Bible, this is other secular historical documents. So there does seem to be something from the past that people have had an experience with that they call God. And so I would say that it's a little bit of a stretch to say that it's something that I just want to be true, not just based on the past, but based on what I've actually gone through. So when we're talking about God, I guess from your understanding, what is that? Like, how would you put a label or description on God? Like, what is that to you?
Well, it depends on who I'm talking to, and it depends on how it is that they define it. For me, it could be a variety of things. The most common description of God that I hear from theists is that of an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving mind that somehow exists outside of space and time, and as such was the factor that set everything in motion. That was what created the universe. It has a plan for us. It is in some way in connection with us, and I don't have a personal definition. I just have what the definitions people have said. So some people think it's a personal God that wants a relationship with you as an individual. Other people are, deists, don't think that, and they think that it's just the force that sets things in motion, but then it's sort of observing.
Right.
And but just real quick, in response to what you said a minute ago, I don't think there's anything strange about deriving the concept. I mean, we can look at life being finite and imagine an endless continuation of that for an eternity. We can imagine a ruler and imagine, a celestial ruler of sorts. We take experiences that we've had in our own lives and then, build the concept of God upon those things that we've gone through already. And I think to a large degree, we have a lot of concepts and vocabulary that we use, that religious people use, where they think they're saying something, but they're really not. And I've heard, when we've talked before in the past, you've described it as, God is immaterial, timeless, and spaceless. Is that a fair description of how you would define it?
Sure. Well, yeah. That's as far as its properties, yeah. But I guess a more refined definition would be like kind of like the first thing actually that you said, I think, which was the mind or the force, the mind behind pretty much everything. Morality, the universe, logic, sense of purpose, all those things. The force that's behind how we recognize these things, I guess you could say.
Right. And so I guess what I would ask you is, what is your evidence and your you said there's a variety of arguments, and I'm interested in knowing what those are from your perspective.
Okay, so the condensed version, because I don't know all the terms, and I'm forgetting, like I said, some of the details, because this would be conversations that we would have to have. So I think, if I'm taking for example, an atheistic worldview seriously, a world in which operates under the assumption that there is no God. Well, first of all, that doesn't mean that you're still not living in a world if a God exists. So the rules that God has established are going to apply to everyone, regardless of your belief in him. So I'm just saying, for as a starting point for me, if I take an atheistic worldview seriously, this world exists without a God. Well, I see that it's really hard for a lot of things to be answered in a way, and then, and I know that this is an answer that's given in good honesty, but I do find, when we get to a certain point, it eventually becomes, well, what caused this? I don't know, and I know that, and I believe you that you don't know, but what I'm trying to point to in that is what is wrong with inferring God at the end of that. See, I believe in the concept of the God of the gaps, in the sense that, I don't think that we should just, oh, hey, we just discovered this new thing. How does it work? Well, God did it. I'm against that. I think that everything should be looked into. But just like when you have a case that involves what appears to be a murderer, if I can gather up evidence and really fully strongly support that or at the very least, that someone murdered this person and that it wasn't just the result of a freak accident, then the conversation shouldn't go from, well, because you can't prove which God did it, I can still not believe in any God. Because there's a huge difference between it just happened to someone did it. And I think that when you look at the evidence and what it entails and what it implies, based on, things like, the laws of logic, uniformity of nature, the the fact that we recognize that we have moral obligations, which I would argue is not something that you would expect to find from an atheistic worldview, where it's just kind of this. I know it's not that. I know it's not everyone who believes this, but survival of the fittest. We just do what we need to do to survive. I find a lot of contradictions within how people argue why we still do the things that we know we ought to do. But the order of life, morality. I know I'm missing some other stuff here, but there's how life unfolded. This is something that I'm learning right now. That's kind of why I was asking Mike to see if he knew anything about it. But I watched one of Michael's videos, and he explained, and he had someone show, like, if we were to basically rewind the tape of life and start all over again, humans would not necessarily look the same that they do, but it shows that, like, the way that we started and how we got to where we are definitely had what at least appears to be some kind of guidance. Now, when you compare that to what would be considered to be a world in which no God exists, you would expect to find the opposite. And so it sounds like a God of the gaps argument, but when you look at the order and structure and uniformity of everything, I don't think it's any more irrational or illogical to infer a God that's working in those details versus it being like, well, there's no reason to assume that a God did it, any more than, well, we have a gun, we have a fingerprint, we have a gunshot wound, someone murdered this person. I don't think it's any more rational to say, well, it just happened, no one did it, than it is to look at the evidence and say all of it and be like, someone had to be behind this. That's kind of how I see it.
So let me respond. You said a lot there.
Yeah.
I mean, and again, please don't take this with any level of disrespect. I mean, I like
go ahead.
you, and there's a reason why you're here. I think you have you're a smart person, but there is nothing that you just said that I don't think is based on some misconception of the view. To begin with, nobody says that anything just happened. And I can understand your intuitions as to why it sounds like it makes sense that there would have to be some sort of initial cause. Of course, then, from my perspective, you're doing a special pleading fallacy where everything else needs a cause but God, and to me, I have some issues with that. But I think, how much experience do you have with philosophy, and how much experience do you have with science? Because when you're talking about observing the uniformity of nature, observing intention, observing guidance, these are things that I don't think that the intuition is unfair, but I think the science and the philosophy of the last several centuries have undone those intuitions. I mean, that is kind of the point of science, is to try to sort of get underneath those intuitions and show which are reasonable in light of the actual evidence and which need to be left behind. And from my understanding of this field, not any of what you just said holds up in light of the evidence. So this is what I meant when I said earlier, I think our core disagreement is on how we're defining evidence to be. Because you're looking at the world and you're saying that this only really makes sense if there is a God. And I'm looking at the world and saying all these things that you're claiming can't be explained without God can entirely be explained without God, and in fact are explained without God. And there's, to some degree, there's a shift on the burden of proof here, because I don't need to disprove God or prove that naturalism, for example, is true, to simply point out the fact that you're adding extra assumptions on top of the observations that the observations themselves don't provide proof of. For example, I would never say that what we observe in the universe through science disproves God, that there couldn't be a God. But it's just that the assumption is unnecessary. There is nothing about science that requires, there's nothing about the equations that we arrive at that require that assumption. And so my thing is, like you mentioned morality, I think morality can be entirely explained without providing the God argument. I think the the way that the universe has evolved can be entirely explained without looking at God as necessary. Even the notions of cause and effect, I think, are problematic.
Let me butt in real fast because he lost connection there, but I didn't want to cut you off for the sake of the viewers because you were making some good points.
Okay.
So I just wanted to let that keep rolling through.
Wait, did you hear any of what I was saying?
He dropped out pretty much right before you went into the morality thing. You were pretty much talking about how you none of this was necessary. Could you kind of could you just kind of repeat that back for him?
Hello. Sure. Yeah, I can hear.
Okay.
Basically, the point is this: everything that you have deemed as only making sense using the God claim, I think, can be explained in better ways. And I actually don't think that, when someone says God did this, you're actually giving an explanation. You're making a claim. You're not actually explaining the relationship among phenomena, as opposed to my perspective on morality. I can go, has detail, has, actual explanation of the relationship between, the relationship among things. So I would just disagree on this necessity that you've expressed.
Sure. Well, so you can, so the thing is that we can have different explanations, and I don't even think that your explanations are illogical. I also would just say that I think that they're wrong. And if we're talking about evidence for God, specifically a God who wants you to choose to believe in him, I would argue that this actually makes my case stronger, because if God leaves it up to you to say, all right, well, this morality is actually mine because outside of me, you're kind of left with a lot of blank spaces that you guys can't really seem to fill in, then, it's up to you. You can either choose to take my morality and make it to your liking, or you can choose to accept and follow the evidence that better supports that there is a mind behind this. I don't think it's special pleading on my side. Again, here's a question that I would love to see a proof for, because unless this can be proven, I'm at least justified in what I believe in. It's often said that people made up the concept of God to explain the things around them. And here's the thing, I don't fully disagree with that. In fact, the way I would differentiate between what constitutes a more plausible God versus one that is clearly made up is look at, I don't know if this has a term for it, but I say, look and see whether or not this supposed God plagiarizes from already existing things. For example, let's take Zeus. Well, okay, yeah, we can look in science and be like, okay, this is actually how lightning and thunder works. The way Zeus has been described to us is that he's a man in the sky who throws lightning bolts down. Well, first of all, there's an assumption that God is a man, and that the funny thing is that Zeus only, even if he does exist, he only has one power. He's in control of lightning. Okay, well, how does that give us a rational explanation for the hundreds of other questions that exist? But again, we can even take a scientific approach and be like, well, we know that thunder or lightning actually travels backwards, and it's not that lightning bolts are being thrown down by a person in the sky. But you take what I call the plagiarism factor. If there's something that is being created from already existing material, that's a good indicator that thing has been stolen. But that's why I pointed back and said, well, how do you explain the people from the past who claimed that they walked alongside what they called God, this thing that they claim created them? How do you explain that? I think that if you want to take the position and say that, well, God, at least the God that I'm describing, the mind, the creator of stuff that we see and recognize today, I would actually want to see why you think that, and why you think that it's better to infer that these people made up this particular concept, and that this God just hasn't always existed. Because then I would argue that seems to be somewhat convenient for your position, because then you're ignoring the evidence that would otherwise prove and show that this thing in fact actually does exist from as far back as we can trace it, and that maybe for some reason now he hasn't chosen to reveal himself in the same way as before. I guess I'm just curious as to what you would say to that, I guess.
Yeah, a few things. To begin with, I think it's better to infer that it was made up simply by what is understood about psychology and human intuition. a lot of our intuitions about what is real has turned out to be incorrect, whether it's intuitions about space and time, which physics has shown to be quite problematic, intuitions about, what caused what. I mean, a lot of these ideologies stemmed from, at the time, much ignorance about the way in which the world worked. So it's not surprising that, people look for patterns. It's not surprising that people, in their fear of death, hold on to a story that promises them eternal life. It's not surprising that, and much is written about this. I mean, the way that mythology has evolved over time and has started. There's nothing about, how these beliefs have come about that's surprising to me once you look at human nature. And I think in the knowledge, I mean, we have much evidence, especially in the context of physics, to support the idea that our intuitions are often problematic and actually inaccurate. And science can help us get underneath these intuitions to actually get at things that are more fundamental about the universe and how it works. And so, while I wouldn't necessarily say that it's purely irrational to have some of these intuitions, when you sort of look at the actual evidence that exists, ultimately the belief that it's true, I think, is unjustified. I think that would be my answer to that question.
Okay, so the people. So okay, I just want to make sure that I got that I pinpointed the answer. So the people who we found historical evidence, stories about how these people claimed that they walked alongside what they called a deity, those were, you believe, false conceptions of something else, I guess? Is that kind of what?
Yeah, and right. So, and I'm willing to give you all the cards, right? Like, I know there's people that will sort of won't even go down that road. Will say that we'll put doubt on the testimonies, the books being legitimate in the first place, and question the validity of the history to begin with. I won't even do that. I'm willing to grant you that Jesus existed as a person, that he had real followers who truly believed in what they were seeing, and that they weren't lying, and that the stories weren't made up as far as what they thought was the case. That to me doesn't convince me one bit, because I know how misguided people can be about reality. And our epistemic limitations are severe, and most people don't recognize this. And of course, they would have recognized this even less at that time, where ignorance about how the world worked was unbelievable.
Mm-hmm.
So
I understand where you're coming from. But so I guess so, because I know one thing that I know for sure is that with these kinds of conversations, we're speaking two different languages, with two different things. I'm just trying to figure out where I want to go with this. So I don't want to talk. Well, we could talk about the resurrection another time, I guess. But I would say, so do you think that? So the people who wrote about this stuff, so do you think that they just didn't see, that they were just misintuitivized, if that's even a word, about what it was that they saw, or like, so do you think that these people? I mean, I could point to the 500, but let's just talk about just the 11 or the 12. They were all, according to what the Bible says, they were all eating dinner or something. They were all gathered together, and Jesus appeared before all 12 of them, and he was interacting with them. Do you think that all 12 of them had the same misconception of Jesus at the same time, and that he was interacting with them in a way that they all were just eating with him as though he was all there simultaneously? Or how do you think that happened, I guess?
Yeah, I would say that they all had, maybe not necessarily exactly the same misconception, but a misconception as to what was going on. I mean, the 500, from my understanding, it's not a historical fact. We can go into that when we debate the resurrection, but I have serious issues with that type of reasoning. But it's not, I mean, look at the 21st century. Look at, someone like, have you ever heard of Satya Sai Baba?
No.
So he's an Indian guru. And essentially all the miracles attributed to Jesus have been attributed to this individual. And this is in a time, not the first century pre-scientific society, but a 21st century where thousands, not 500, not 12, but thousands of his followers, college educated, many with science degrees, believed that this guy was God on earth, that he could heal the sick, resurrect the dead, was said to even be born of a virgin, if I'm not mistaken, was said to have come back to life, I would have to refresh my memory, but
sure.
All testimonies from thousands of eyewitnesses of supernatural claims. And what happens when people actually go investigate these things? Then we see, psychological tricks, misconceptions. There's one example in particular of people that saw, again, hundreds of eyewitnesses seeing this, I think was the sun moving or setting on fire or something. And I forget exactly I have to go back, but
okay,
there was a person there at the time that had a telescope and was actually bringing people along saying, look, this is not what's going on. You're seeing a phenomena there that's not actually what you're claiming it is. And people still wouldn't believe. So all these things can be explained in terms of psychology and in terms of limitation of our senses. And yes, you can say, well, I'm assuming or I'm sort of speculating, but at least I'm using things that have been observed in human nature, as opposed to claims of the supernatural that have not been shown to be real in actuality, let alone in possibility outside of an epistemic technicality, meaning we don't have all knowledge, so it's possible that somehow a miracle could take place. It's possible that someone could be raised from the dead, just because we can't disprove it. But I never see any actual building of evidence in support as to why I actually trust that this actually took place.
Sure. And this is probably, you probably don't know the answer because you haven't experienced it, at least from what I know. But do you think that seeing something like that would significantly impact you in any way, as far as swaying you to, okay, God exists because I saw this?
No, and not because I wouldn't necessarily want it to, because like I said, there are many times where I think believing in God would be beneficial in terms of comfort, okay? But it wouldn't sway me because of what I understand to be our limitations in terms of epistemology. Like when you claim that God exists, my thing is you can't make that claim rationally because you lack the methodology to make that claim. And when I sort of pointed that out, your response online when we debated, went back and forth was, well, why would you think that God would need to stoop to your standards?
Yes.
My response is, it's not about God. It's about what we can rationally say, given the tools that we have. If God wants to be known, then it doesn't make sense to not give us, to give us a mind, to give us the ability to think, and then not open his existence up to the same kind of method that we use to understand reality the rest of the time, rationally speaking. So I'm not saying that because we can't discover God in this way, that therefore I know it's not true. I would just say that to claim it exists is completely unjustified.
Okay. So I will say that the notion of God isn't necessarily always a comfort. There might be some people who seem to give off that image, but I can tell you for a fact that when I was in the military for 6 years and I hated life, God was the last thing that I was interested in. I never I kind of like, because like I know he's probably still there, but right now, like, I just don't want anything to do with him. Like, and the message of the gospel in and of itself is not something that gives anyone comfort. And this actually, everything that you said kind of ties back in a little bit to what we talked about before. If God's purpose in how he is known is through a method, I'll say that it is kind of a method, because the gospel message is a method, so to speak. It's going to look different for how it pans out in different people's lives, because we all have different lives. But the message of the gospel, first of all, is offensive, but it leaves the choice up to the individual. If God wants you to know him for a specific reason, then I think it makes sense to say that the choice is up to you, but that you have to do what. If to give a scientific example of this, I do think, in a sense, that God is testable, observable, and repeatable. But in the same way that you can't look at bacteria or something with anything other than a microscope, you have to follow the method. It's not that God's trying to be mean or anything like that, but if I come with my glasses, some other guy comes with his goggles, some other guy has a magnifying glass, and some other guy has like a telescope or something like that, and we're all trying to look at this thing that I'm calling a germ that you haven't seen before, but you're trying to approach it with what you think is sufficient. I'm coming with my glasses because they improve my vision. This other guy's coming with a magnifying glass because it makes things look bigger or whatever. If I say you need to look it through the microscope if you want to see this, it's not that God is trying to be like, well, in a sense it is, but he is kind of trying to be like, well, it is my way or the highway, but in the same way that if you want to look at germs, you got to look through a telescope. I would argue that the method exists for a reason, and it's because it's the only way that it works. If you try to find germs with anything outside of a telescope, you're never going to find it. But if you're so set on saying, no, my glasses, this is the best way that I can see, therefore I'm going to trust my glasses. I don't know whatever that thing is that you have over there, this thing that you call a telescope, but I'm not going to even bother looking into it, because I think that the way that I view the world through my glasses is sufficient for seeing that this thing that you call germs. Unless you can prove that to me with how I choose to operate, then I don't have to believe that what you're saying is true. That's kind of the way. And so the method is there for a reason, but that's why I think that when you look at, I guess you could say, the question marks in life, every step we make, I know that it's probably annoying at some point, but from the atheist perspective, but every step we make in progress with like scientific discoveries, you always hear that Christian being like, see, this infers God. And that's what we're trying to get you to do, I guess you could say. This is what the language difference is. In a sense, it does require taking a step of faith from the same example that I just gave. I understand that from your perspective, you think that your glasses are the best way for you to see things. I'm saying you need to look in the microscope, and unless you look in the microscope, you're never going to see it. And then in the same way that we search for discoveries for new things, that's no more irrational or illogical for finding God, so to speak, than looking for a discovery. We don't say, well, unless I can prove that I'm going to find a cure for cancer, then I'm not going to even bother to do the work to start looking into this thing. And I think so, even from a scientific standpoint, there are some concepts, and I think that with some atheists, I think that they feel like they're throwing reason and logic out the window with faith, but I also think that faith isn't properly represented. So I'll give you that. But I think that finding God is similar in that same sense. So when I say that, when I say that he doesn't bow to your methodologies, it's still true, but it's not because God's trying to be mean. It's that if God submits to your methods, then he really isn't the thing that he claims to be. If God can be testable, observable, and repeatable by your standards, who's really the God in that instance, if that makes sense?
That part does. So that part, the last thing you said, doesn't make sense to me. And I will say that to me, there is a deep irony in what you've just described, because I agree with you, but I think it's with the analogy of the telescope, but I think it's the other way around.
Sure.
I think your methodology is having the glasses on claiming that you see reality better than the telescope or the microscope. I mean, so it's, to me, it's inverted. And I agree with you that I don't take atheists who claim they know there is no God. I don't take those people seriously because I don't think they're being scientific in their approach. But I don't see faith as being a reliable path to truth or knowledge. And when you talk about, this is the method God chooses because it's the best way for us to have a choice in our approach, I am living proof that that's not true because I don't choose what I find convincing.
Sure.
There's nowhere in what I find convincing do I feel like I'm making a choice of any kind. And like I said, there were times in my life where I wanted to believe and simply couldn't. So it's not a matter of he's giving us this context in which we are free to reject or embrace him. And for me to even have that choice, I would have to know that he exists. And from my perspective, I have no method that would bring me to that conclusion in a way that I think is rational. And again, for the same thing with free will. I mean, there was any idea that I wanted to be philosophically true in my life was the idea that free will makes sense. And I spent 15 years trying to find an argument that would be satisfactory. This is, talk about wishful thinking. That was my version of wishful thinking, and I couldn't find it. So I don't believe based on what I want to be true. I believe based on what I happen to be convincing. And if there is a God, he has made me that way. He has structured my mind to be that way. And so to then say that I am rejecting God and therefore should suffer an eternity without God for simply living as I have been made, I think is completely incoherent.
Well, so I would say that you do know, at least you have knowledge, whether you recognize that it's related or not. You have knowledge of God because you recognize morality. Now, this goes back to what I said. You can either say laws come from lawgivers. I'm stealing a Frank Turek kind of line here, but you can either logically conclude, which I don't think that there's anything illogical about concluding this, saying that laws come from lawgivers. And this is something that I would like to actually talk to you more about because I probably don't know all of the details, but from where I'm at, I don't see a logical solution to the problem of morality from an atheistic standpoint. And that should be enough. If I'm correct in my conclusions on everything that I know, that should be enough information just to logically conclude, okay, there has to be something above humanity that has given us this ability. And then once you get to that point, God exists from that perspective because God is what we call good. And so if you recognize that there are moral oughts and not-nots, you understand the mind of God because God is the same way. Now, we might not be 100% as to what we specifically find to be true, but you know enough about what the Bible calls moral and immoral to have at least one standard from the Bible that lines up with what God says. And I think that if you can come to the point where you're basically like, well, okay, I recognize that morality exists, and if it's up to humanity, that's going to get us into a lot of trouble. Therefore, just in the same kind of way that we sort of, it's not that we make laws, but we enact them and we enforce them. Those laws came from a lawgiver. When you're driving down the road, you see a stop sign. Well, that stop sign didn't just get there. You know that someone put it there and they put it there for a purpose. I would say that you can infer God in the same way based on your conscience, in the same way that you can see a stop sign or any sign and be like, that sign has a meaning and a purpose and someone put it there for a reason. And then say that sign, that law goes above and beyond, just me or whatever, and say, okay, so God must exist. So what does he expect from me? And then this is where I would point you back to the gospel. Because the gospel says that at some point we've broken the law, and it's not so. And I think that this is kind of what you were hinting at, and I just want to make sure, not just for you, but for everyone else watching too. But there also seems to be this misconception, which I will say that based on kind of how I see Christians talking about God, there does seem to be this implication that Christians explain it to atheists in this way that it seems like you seem to understand it, which is that being a Christian is simply believing that God exists. Now, I will give it to you that that's important. That's a step in the process. But if that's what you think, but if that's what you think it is, because I know that some atheists actually think this.
Yeah, it's more than that.
Yeah, it's more than that. Exactly. Yeah. It's once you acknowledge that God exists, the only thing I would say that's left to do is to, since you know that you've broken his laws, well, that kind of puts you in a really awkward situation with your creator. And I think that that's where the person of Jesus would come in very perfectly. This would balance out who God says he is. You know, he's loving and just, but he can't neglect one or the other. And so he's giving, I think, us an opportunity now to recognize our standing with him. And I don't think that you have to, I don't think that you have to really make too much of a stretch to say like, well, this just sounds silly or this is illogical. This all, legalistically makes sense. We see this same kind of structure even in society. If someone breaks the law, there are consequences for our actions. Now, I get that from our relative perspective, it looks a little bit differently, but when you see or hear about someone doing something wrong, you want justice. We all want justice. But I'm wondering how that concept can be grounded logically from a position of there is nothing out there that's telling us objectively that we ought to be this way. And so I'm saying that from where you're at, I don't think that it's irrational or too much of a leap to be like, there has to be something else out there that gave us this sense of morality, and I need to account to this thing for my moral standing with him. But that's just my thoughts. Feel free to,
Yeah, I think it's entirely irrational given what I understand morality to be and where it comes from. So the first thing you said is you don't think it's a fallacy to say that, you look at laws, that it must be a lawgiver. The same thing has to be applied to morality. The first thing I'll point out is that is the same type of fallacy that people use or fall into when they make the argument from design, that because two things share complexity, both things must have been created. This is a fallacy. Because just because something share a quality doesn't mean that they share all qualities. So a watch was made, a watch was designed, right, and it was made, I think, in the 17th or 18th century. I don't know. I'm just going to throw a date. I forget it.
Well, yeah, well back ago, yeah.
And so a watch is complex, and a watch was designed, and a watch was made in 1777. Therefore, the universe is complex. Mm-hmm. Therefore, the universe must be designed. Therefore, the universe was made in 1977. Obviously, that doesn't follow. So that's my first problem with what you just described. My second problem is that it's not just about what is deemed as legal or illegal, because laws have changed over time, and many laws that were viewed as legal at one point then became illegal because we saw that it was immoral. So at one point, black people couldn't, be in the same schools as white people, and that was the law. And then we evolved to recognize that was bullshit, and we evolved from that. Now, I will grant you one thing, that the moral argument for a lot of atheists is a problematic one. They often stumble, they fall into saying, well, then it's subjective, and they start doing little side steps, and it's a bunch of anxiety. But from my perspective, it's actually the easiest the easiest issue in philosophy is how to ground morality outside of any kind of supernatural claim. And I wonder, what is your experience with moral philosophy? What has your journey been? Because I think if you were exposed to some of the things that I've read in my career, as I do philosophy for a living.
Sure.
You might not be saying the same things with the certainty that you're saying them.
Well, so we have. Let me actually. I do want to. I actually do want to take. Let me open up a. Where's my thing?
And I'll give you my argument for how I can ground morality outside of this. But I'm just wondering,
Sure.
what have you been exposed to in terms of moral philosophy that has led you, besides what the religion says?
I mean, I'll admit, not much. That's why I was going to say, because you mentioned something. I was actually going to open. I'm trying to find my note here, so I can open it. And if you have any suggestions, I'm going to write them down so I can look them up. Hold on a second.
And I can do that. Well, maybe I'll do it here for anybody else listening.
Oh, okay, that works. I do. So one interesting. I don't know if this is kind of where you were going, but so the thing is though. Is that okay? So like with like the whole thing of racism, for example, right? Yes, we changed it. But I think what you'll find with a lot of the things that we change laws on are still, I would say I could still argue are still based on the Bible. For example, Jesus said that the law can be summed up in these two things: love God and love others. Well, I don't find it very loving for people to discriminate against someone else who has different colored skin, right? And even in the Bible, Paul made it clear. He's like, in Christ, there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free. In other words, he's saying we're all equal in the eyes of God. And it's interesting because even our founding fathers who believed in God basically said the same thing. Now, I know that some people use the Bible ironically to justify slavery and this kind of behavior, but I also find it interesting that these same people try to twist the Constitution to fit what they wanted to say, and they intentionally kept their slaves illiterate to what the Bible said, and I know exactly why that is, because there are certain verses that are very damning for the kinds of ideas and things that they're pushing. It's very clear that they were hiding something. Now, I know that in the context of what was going on, both sides owned people as slaves. But as I understand it, the side who was it? Who was it that my history is really bad. Who was it that freed the slaves?
Lincoln.
Lincoln. I mean, even some of these people who eventually righted the documents to free slaves, yes, they owned them, but arguably, I would say that they treated them better. Because if they just let them go, well, where are they going to go? In a society that's based on racism, if you let your slave go, it's better for them to stay there for the time being until you enact the law. But some people will say and say, well, these people claim to believe in God, but they were still owning slaves. But it's like, okay, yeah, but at the same time, it's like, where are they going to go? Where are they going to go without being mistreated? And so it just little things like that. But when you look at, I think the argument that I heard was that if you look at any culture, what you will find is that as it pertains to morality, you will find that people will often enact laws to basically do what's good for who they consider to be, their fellow, with tribes. You see this, they might treat outsiders differently, but there's still this idea of treating, other human beings with decency and respect, kind of in a sense, just for the sake of doing that. Now, when you look at the Bible, where it says love God, love others, and then there are also a bunch of other things, like that's at the heart of everything. Like, I don't agree that just because if you're a homosexual that you should be treated differently. I don't believe that if you're not a Christian that you should be treated differently. I think that everyone is deserving of, respect. And yes, it does come from my Bible. I'm not saying that that's necessarily why it's right. I recognize that, but I'm saying that this text that I have, I actually have a Bible here. This text that talks about an all-loving God that claims to be God inspired says you ought to treat others, with the basic sense of respect. Love God and love others. If you love God, you will love others, because you will share, I guess you could say, the kind of love that you've been given through forgiveness of your sins by the gospel, and you will pass that on, so to speak, to other people who are also made in the image of God. So that's kind of what I would say. But we all recognize this idea, even with laws that say, well, you're black, so you can't drink from this water fountain. We all recognize that that's bad, but I'm saying that you can still tie that principle back to the Bible. So
Yeah, but so I'll respond in a couple of ways, and then I'll sort of try to ground morality for you in a way that might be more accessible. I agree with you that there are passages in the Bible that can be used for good. There are passages that I would 100% say are moral and are against slavery and are against violence and all those things. But there's also passages in the Bible that are clearly for it, although it's a different type of slavery than what we would see now, but it's certainly a type of slavery. There's passages in the Bible that are not at all about loving the neighbor. It's about violence and genocide. And my issue is that, because we've talked about this before, and you, from my perspective, excuse the clear immorality that we see in parts of the Bible by saying, well, God's the boss. God decides. And so because you've already defined a priori God to equal goodness, God to equal justice, then anything is going to fit that definition. And I think that is what I would consider a very irrational type of dogmatism, because it's like no type of evidence can be brought to you to show the problem with that. And basically what you're doing is you're arguing for divine command theory, which is extremely problematic for a variety of reasons. I'll go into that now, and then I'll ground morality. First of all, if what you're saying is true, whatever is moral is subjective to whatever God decides in the moment. If God came down to earth right now and said, I've decided that rape is good, well then, because God is goodness, rape is good because God is the lawgiver and what he says goes. That to me doesn't work. Now, if you want to say that God wouldn't do that, because there is something inherent to goodness that God embodies, well then goodness is an adjective in that context. So even if God created the nature of what is good and what is evil, it's now independent of pure commandment. So now to claim that it's about law giving, you can't have it both ways. I dismiss this approach because I think if it's anything, I think it's the end of morality, not the beginning. And like I said, so I'll go into. I mean, I don't know how much time we have, but I'll try to go into this a little bit, and then of course,
Can I ask you a quick question along the lines of what you said real fast? Is justice good?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, I would agree with you. I don't think that God would command, but I'm saying, I think that even if you just look at the Bible, for example, Noah, Sodom and Gomorrah. I mean, we're clearly given enough context to support the notion that God was pretty just in what he did. Therefore, it follows that he was good if he's just.
That's completely open. I mean, I think it's very open to interpretation, especially given the context of an all-powerful being. And I don't think that eternal punishment, however you want to define that, can be said to be just, given the context of what life is. And again, I know you say, well, who am I to say that if God exists and says so? But again, that's where I think the problem lies. And to me, what you're describing, the example of laws is problematic because we at least, we have the option as a culture and a society to decide. I mean, at least if you live in a democracy, if that can even be said to still be a thing nowadays, but at least we have the option to elect those laws, to go about deciding what society we want to live in. What you're describing is, from my perspective, at best a dictatorship. We don't have a choice in any of what could happen. It's forced upon us, and I know you think it's a choice, but I don't think it is. And here's the thing. Here's how I'll try to break it down for you.
Okay.
It's a problem of language. To ask, is goodness good, is a misunderstanding of the role that language plays when it's actually saying something true about the world. The only thing that you need to ground morality external from God is that consciousness exists. And that, I mean, I assume you believe in consciousness, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you believe that suffering and well-being are states of consciousness?
Sorry, suffering. Sorry, say one more time.
Would you agree
believe
that suffering and well-being are states of consciousness? In other words, to suffer.
I would say yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, it sounds maybe counterintuitive to you, but that is literally all you need. Because how I would break it down is in terms of phenomenology. Whatever grounds suffering and well-being is not a matter of culture. It's not a matter of opinion. It's a matter of nature. When you look at neuroscience, when you look at psychology, when you look at phenomenology, you'll start to see patterns. You'll start to see that these assumptions that we have that somebody can just, their notions of well-being can be that they go and rape people and kill people, and that's what brings them meaning, what makes them feel good, is pure delusion. When you look at serial killers, you see that these are people who are deeply unhappy. They're simply reacting on impulses that they can't control. Okay, I'm not excusing the behavior. It's fucking horrific, right? But they're not people that have reached the same height of well-being as somebody who has embraced altruism. Okay, so people misunderstand pleasure with well-being most often. And what I would say is that, here's an example. Would you would agree that, physical pain, like if I put my hand on a hot stove, that's going to hurt, correct?
Yeah.
Now, the fact that you might experience that subjectively and I might experience it subjectively doesn't mean that we can talk about it in objective terms. It's still a fact that we can communicate about, that putting your hand on a stove, if you have a normal working brain, is going to cause you pain, right?
Yes.
So the fact that there are people with pain disorders who can't experience that phenomena doesn't undermine the objectivity of the phenomena that we're describing in terms of pain for us, speaking about us.
Well, that'd be considered an anomaly, though.
Right, but it's not a problem for the objectivity of the grounding of pain in that context. Correct?
Sure.
The same exact thing applies to morality. The fact that there are psychopaths who can't feel well-being or suffering in the same way doesn't make morality subjective in the sense that it's relative or that it falls apart, because you can point to these anomalies that once you understand their context, isn't a problem. So all you need to do to ground morality is to look at nature. You mentioned survival of the fittest earlier. If you look at what that means, it actually means the species that are more likely to collaborate are the more likely to survive. It's not about the strongest. It's not about who you can, control or destroy. It's about collaboration. We see certain type of moral intuitions among animals. Obviously not to the degree that we do, and they don't conceptualize it the same way, but some of the instincts we can observe to a degree. Until you can bring me an example of somebody that can behave a certain way without suffering the phenomenological consequences that will automatically take place as a fact of nature, then you don't have an argument for morality not being able to be grounded in my atheistic worldview, because all you have to do is look at nature. And yes, I understand people do the whole is ought problem. How do you derive an ought from an is? Again, that is a misconception of language, because ought is always concerned with goals in any context. So to assume that in the moral context, we need to have some sort of justification that goes beyond the description of the facts is simply a misunderstanding of language. There is no is ought problem. There's always, even in science, we care about values. Science is based on evidence. Well, you have to value evidence to do science in the first place. So the whole is ought problem is an illusion, as far as I'm concerned. The question of is goodness good is a complete, nonsense question. It misses the point. It's like saying, is the temperature of cold cold? Is the experience of the phenomenological experience of coldness what it is? It's self-explained in the concept. It's simply definitional. So what else could we mean by good and bad except for suffering and well-being? Why is it that we don't think we have a moral obligation towards rocks, and we think we have one towards people or other animals? Because we don't think rocks can suffer. That's something that we could be objectively incorrect about. That's something that we could get wrong. So that is how I would break this down. And people are confused about the nature of subjectivity versus objectivity. They're confused about the is-all problem. I will leave it at that. I think we're about to do.
Sure.
Yeah, respond to that.
I just want to get clarification to make sure that I'm understanding. Shoot. I was trying to follow with everything. So your starting point is that consciousness basically is the I can't think of my words right now. The grounding for morality. That's kind of your first, okay? And then from there you said that what can you kind of say again? So as far as the oughts and ought nots, real quick, can you go over that one more time?
Sure. So consciousness
Briefly.
is the mode. Consciousness is the mode that which we operate in, and as being conscious creatures entails that we have a capacity to experience well-being and a capacity to suffer. And when we're talking about morality, we're talking about the kind of results that our behavior will lead to. So why is it wrong to rape somebody? Because you're causing them suffering. Because you're causing yourself suffering. It's an action that we can call evil because it's an action that will cause needless suffering.
Okay.
And yeah. So as far as the is ought, again, it's the problem is bypassed when you recognize that when we use language and we use definitions for certain things, we're simply describing is all the time. Like you're concerned with well-being and suffering too, because you're concerned with an eternity of well-being with God and an eternity of suffering in hell. So the is all problem remains the same even for your worldview, because I could say, well, why should I give a shit about being with God as opposed to being in hell? Why does it matter? It's always a value judgment. So if I have an is all problem, so do you. Is my point.
Okay. I'll give that further consideration. So I see that Mike put up the thing there on the bottom of the screen. So I'm not sure if.
And I hope I didn't say, I want this to be more about but you asked me to give you this perspective, so I don't want to take up.
Yeah, no, I realized I'd been talking a lot earlier, so I kind of wanted to.
I didn't
give you some time.
I didn't want anybody to feel as if they didn't, or they left the show not being able to say what they would want to say. And Cease is, is my co-host on the show. So David, if there's anything that you want to say as a last word before we go into anything else, or if you guys feel you want to skip Q&A and you just want to finish it out with conversation, that's fine. Just however you guys want to do it.
I didn't really have I was trying to just mostly understand what he was saying, so that I can take that back and think about it, because I haven't heard it explained that way. So I don't want to say that I agree or disagree with anything that he said until I have time to think about it. So I don't really have really much else to say about what he said right there. So
and David, you're welcome to come back and discuss this further. We can have a conversation in the future, and I appreciate you being here and you sharing your testimony, and I do respect you in that sense.
Well,
Thanks, man. I appreciate it.
I want to add to what you said at the end there, David, is a testament to, because I was thinking the whole time that was a really good conversation. So that just highlights you being part of being 50% of that, in the sense of that you would ask him, hey, can you clarify? And that's, I love seeing that on either side of people, because it shows that, hey, I genuinely want to have a conversation. I'm not trying to preach or shove anything. And that can go on either side. I mean, that could go with either side.
Right.
So I just appreciate that as a viewer, just watching from behind the scenes.
Before we get to the Q&A question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I know that this wasn't necessarily anyone in particular's fault, although I feel like someone could have stepped in sooner. But I was going to say, Mike, I agree with you, because when I was on that that giant show on Tart that last time when you guys had the quantum physicist. I was off in the back. I was I was backstage and I was just watching it. And man, I was just so upset when I saw, Mark of Legend freaking just, I was like, dude, just shut up. Like, let him finish a sentence, dude. Like, I hate it when people do that. And I was actually genuinely upset that he kept interrupting you. I'm like, let Mike finish a sentence.
I appreciate
it. Try to understand what he's saying.
Well, I'm the worst with it, to be fair. That's something I'm working on. And I think it comes out of me more whenever, if someone else is doing it, then I'm going to do it a lot. But if I do it, then they'll probably do it. So it's like an endless cycle. And it's like, we started it, but it'll never end, essentially.
Yeah.
But no, yeah, I do that to Mark. Mark does that to me. But at the end of the day, we're still friends.
Okay. It's still, I hate it. And then it literally happened to me later that same day with Ben. I know he probably, he probably didn't mean to. Maybe I wasn't explaining my answer well enough or something. But then I got frustrated because I saw it happen to you, and then it started happening to me, and I'm like, oh, it's gonna be one of those. I
would love to say I want the person to be here to defend themselves, but Mark knows that this is my biggest contention, is that it's the language games.
Okay.
And so I think me and Cease have a huge bond in how we see linguistics used in a way that we might not agree with. And when it happens for me, I know that's what kind of sets me off, because I'm like, we can't have a conversation about anything because we're just talking right past each other.
And actually,
we've got better on that for sure. And last few
and before we go piggybacking off what you just said, before going to the Q&A or whatever you might want to add, going back to what you said earlier in the beginning of the show, how you define God, David, is the second you define him or it, whatever, as immaterial, you have to answer the mind-body problem. You have to explain to me the mind-body problem. Have you ever heard of that?
I haven't.
Okay, so that's something to look into, because you have to explain to me how something that's of an immaterial substance can interact with what is material. So the dualist perspective, to me, is incredibly flawed for that reason, because it can't answer it can't answer how one can interact with the other if there are two different substances. And to just say, well, God is magical and can just do it, to me is not an explanation. So that's why I'm a physicalist, because I reject a duality. I think there is only one thing.
Okay.
Now we can have a conversation about consciousness and that at a later date, perhaps. But I just want to sort of throw that in there too. Examine the mind-body problem, because that is a problem for your definition of God as you've expressed it.
Okay. Can you either send this to me in the chat, the things that we talked about? I think I asked. Yeah, there's a source that I asked. Did I ask for a source? And then whatever this, I don't even know how to spell this thing that you just mentioned. If you could put it in the comments over here or send it to me somehow.
Yeah, I'll send it. Are you also on the Discord by any chance, or no?
I think I am. I logged into it earlier. I saw Jeff had posted something on there.
Okay, well, I'll send it to you after the show. I'll send it to you on the chat here, and you can look into it.
Okay. Excuse me. Sounds good. I'm really gassy right now.
Mike, you're muted. I can't hear you.
Yeah.
That helps. You're gassy, and I'm nothing apparently. So. I was gonna say you should look at all the Coke Zero bottles and stuff that are around me, so I know what it's like to be. Like, you all right? Yeah, just Coke Zero.
That's funny.
Yeah. I was gonna say, everybody, also, if you want to have these kind of conversations or have a conversation with Cease or David, the Discord is a good spot. I'll do a better job at promoting that in the future shows. That's something that slipped my head. But if you need any other reference on that, if you watch any of the TART or the Atheist Roundtable shows, you will get all you need hooked up on the Discord, plus the man himself who owns the Discord, being Jeff. So. But that's a really good place if you want to have these conversations. If you watch this video in the future and you're like, how do these guys meet, or how do they have conversations? Boom, Discord, that's the place to do it. And then maybe recruit some people to your own show or something. That's kind of I'm trying to get Matt Slick on the show, but wait for his response. But that's how you get in touch with some people. So
Bill Hunt, he already completely destroyed him. So
he responded. Me and Matt had a conversation for a while, and then he stopped talking, and it was it just seemed as if like he just stopped checking Discord like that, or he just was like, I don't like this guy. So but anyway, first question we got is for Cease. Who is the best theistic philosopher in regards to morality?
Oh, that's an interesting question.
And I'm going to tack on another part to that.
Oh, Spartan theology. I know him.
If you're best theistic and best atheistic, if you would even consider that, or agnostic, or whatever you would consider.
Yeah, I mean, as far as theistic, this is more aimed towards existentialism. But Kierkegaard, is an interesting theist philosopher to examine. Although it's also not as focused on morality, but there's some of that. I'm trying to think. The thing is, because I've never heard an argument for morality from the religious perspective that I found valuable, they're all more or less on the same line for me.
I was going to ask you. I was about to ask you if it's a theistic, foundation for morality. Does that not have the same problem every single time, regardless of how it's whatever the branded cheese it is, it's still.
Well, no, because some are better because instead of making about commandments, they kind of approach it the way that I am. They're talking about nature.
Sure.
So they simply add the additional assumption that the nature has to be created by God, which I dismiss.
Okay.
But I can't think of a particular name off the top of my head that I could say, like that.
Fair enough. Okay. I'll extend that to David. If David, since you're a theist, if you know any good theistic philosophers?
I mean, as far I don't know if I assume the question was more with regards to asking an atheist who they know. I mean, a theist philosopher could technically be any pastor, so technically, but right now my go-to guy, I think Michael from Inspiring Philosophy does a pretty solid job of explaining a lot of things, and morality is one of them. So
yeah, I actually I don't agree with his position, but I like hearing his talks on normative ethics and things like that, just because it's generally with people that I've ended up looking up to. So it wasn't like I went out of my way, but even though I disagree with them, I like Michael. I feel like he's a genuine person in regards to his arguments. I can tell it's what he believes, but I just disagree with the.
Yeah, right. I have no idea who he is as a person. I'm sure he's a nice person. As far as his arguments, I think are so flawed. I mean, almost every video he posts, there's like 20 things wrong with it that make me cringe. Maybe we'll do some video breakdowns in the future of his stuff.
With his physics videos that have to do with quantum physics. Those are the ones that I'm like, yeah, stop.
And I'm not trying to be disrespectful towards anybody. I'm sure he's a nice person, but
this is your field, so I could understand that.
It just.
Oops.
But anyway, so this was a question from Crystal earlier. I kind of answered it in the comments. We might have just answered it right now. But out of curiosity, is all this information off the top of your heads, or do you guys prepare or do preparatory research for this too?
Do you want to go first? Okay. So if I'm just having a conversation, I don't like to prep, because then I'm going to feel like I have to just dump information kind of, and I don't want to do that in a conversation. So I go off the top of my head. That way, it's kind of a two-way thing. It's like, so that way I know what I know just in a situation where I don't prepare. That way it kind of helps me see like, okay, this is what I forgot about during this conversation that I probably should have known. So it still allows me to go back, but there isn't the the over prep. Like Michael over preps. Like, and every time he debates someone, he always over prepares. He always has like a bunch of information that he can throw, but he's more going into debates. I don't want to come into a conversation over prepared from that perspective, because I just don't want it to feel like I'm trying to have a debate when I'm trying to have a conversation, if that makes sense. Because there is a difference between a debate and a conversation. I mean, I do think about things throughout the day sometimes. Like I kind of knew I was going to be on here today, but I didn't necessarily know what we were going to talk about. So I was kind of just juggling ideas in my head throughout the day of things that could have been brought up, which I don't even know if any of them were. I don't remember. But I prepare it from that standpoint. But yeah, I guess that would kind of be my answer. So
sure. Fair enough.
Well, first, shout out to Crystal because she's an amazing person and a really good friend of mine. So I'm glad that you're listening. But no, to answer a question, I prepare ahead of time when it comes to debates. Like if I'm going to debate someone, I will have an outline of every point and every argument and every fallacy that I see in the opponent's perspective. As far as this type of conversation, to me, this is second nature because I've been doing this for so long that I know what I believe, like the back of my hand. Like I don't need to have notes. I already know what I'm going to say. And I've been looking at these arguments and these type of approaches for, like 16 years now. I was, I think, 15 when I started reading this stuff and reading the Bible and reading these arguments. So I don't even know it's just out of the, purely because of the fact that I've been doing this for so long that it's just, muscle memory at this point in that.
Yeah. I can relate to that in the sense of like when you play a show or something and you go up and people are like, oh, you got to practice or warm up. Like, no, you just pick up guitar and you're
right, exactly.
The muscle memory. I mean, it's like nothing to it. As long as you practice it at some point, it's there. Let's see. We had another question here from Mr. GeoSam. And GeoSam. Yes, and by the way, GeoSam does some really awesome. If you guys see the guys in Tart. Or the guys in the Atheist, the Empathetic Atheist, who Wes is a producer for that show, who's also on ours, and then I was on Tart as well. So we were kind of like a big love, three-way love child of atheism. But here we go. So GeoSam asks, Axioms on Trial. What was the methodology used to determine that morality is external to humans? So I would assume that this would be for you, Cease, since you...
Yeah, I would answer that in a number of different ways. Keeping in mind that every framework is not self-justifying, so you have to start somewhere. But empiricism, logic, and Cartesian deconstruction, which is basically you try to eliminate as many assumptions about the world and reality as you can, and you're left with, at least, if nothing else, the understanding that you exist as a mind, so to speak. I mean, obviously, I reject dualism for many reasons, but simply for the sake of argument, that at least if you doubt everything that exists, you're something capable of doubting. So if you trust that, we are naturally inclined to trust logic to some degree, that words have meaning, that we can understand things and we can talk about things, that is at least one truth we can point to, that we are something that is thinking. Now, whatever it means to be something that's thinking, and then how we rebuild, to what level can we trust the senses, to what level we can trust the external world, these are all things that are problematic, and to what degree are the tools we have capture reality is something that I think is quite unsure. And I'm not a realist in that sense. Like, I think there's some real philosophical problems with that question. But that's, I know it's not a very satisfactory answer, but that's as much as I can say at the moment.
Sure. All right. And then we had one for David here. That is, what denomination is David?
So I
might put you on the spot there. I wasn't gonna answer, and I was like, I'll put it in the Q&A.
No, that's fine. I probably should know this by now. But okay, so from a biblical standpoint, I try to avoid divisions. I'm not saying that divisions are inherently wrong. I just find that they literally end up becoming a point of contention, in which case, hence the term division. If I had to go off of a definition, I believe that I would be Reformed Protestant, I think. I actually was having a conversation about this with a Christian either yesterday or the day before, actually. So good timing on the question. Otherwise, I probably would have forgotten that part alone. But I think I'm Reformed Protestant. I know it's cheesy, but I try my denomination, my division, so to speak. I try to make it about what the Bible says in its context. I don't want to cling to or claim a specific denomination or division, because they usually have their kind of what they're known for, and usually, especially with today, with how divided everything is, just that alone already kind of starts people off on the wrong foot. It's making assumptions about you. And so I feel like if you say like, well, I don't have a denomination, people are going to be confused about that and be like, well, why don't you have a denomination? Then I can explain, well, because I think that this is God's word and that we should take it in context for what it says and not get caught up on divisions. But again, not saying that denominations are inherently bad. That's just a personal thing for me. I probably have a definition of what I am based on what I believe, but I don't know what it is. So,
okay. I got I guess 3 questions if we can answer them quickly.
Sure. I'll try and keep them short.
So I think they should be fine. But another one I got 2 from Crystal and then 1 from Joseph, I believe. And they're good questions, so I want to get them all in. But again, out of curiosity, what is the intent of this? Was it a conversation and I think this is a great question to ask, because you get a lot of people that go, what do you do this? What's the point of this?
Wait, is it conversion or did you mean conversation? It says conversion.
I read was it conversion? I think it was conversation is what I'm reading.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I read it as conversation. I think that's what would make the most sense, at least. I'm not going to fill in my answer to this because this is for YouTube, but I would say that that this is a question I get a lot, and it's never satisfactory when I give them. They always look at me weird. So I kind of stopped caring. I'm just never going to make people satisfied on why I satisfy myself with this. So what do you guys have to say?
Did you want to? Okay. I mean, based on what I believe in, I believe that there obviously is a God. So my intent is obviously to spread the word, so to speak. And, I think it really comes down to personal choice for people, but it's hopefully to make people at least aware enough or intrigued enough to look into this, because at the end of the day, I do think that it's a personal choice. So it's ironic because it says, was it conversion? I mean, in a sense, yes, I'm out to convert people, so to speak, but not by forcing it. Like, conversion is a personal choice, I think. So that's why I do it, to get the truth out of what I believe is the ultimate truth that we're all trying to look for. And I think that it's God. So
I'll answer this in a couple different ways. One is to find common ground with people who I see, who I disagree with, because I think that's valuable. I think these conversations, to challenging your own ideas and the ideas of others is helpful to grow as a person. So there's sort of that personal aspect to it. There is also, like I said, I am out to convert people to what I think is the most rational approach to reality, because I do think that religion is dangerous in a lot of ways, and I think irrationality is dangerous in a lot of ways. And also, I would say, for the audience, for people that are watching who are questioning, who are unsure what to think, who are, I want to spread ideas that I think are good. And so, that can only happen through conversation, through not necessarily even debates, because often that, people already have their sides picked, but to just the sharing of ideas and putting pressure on ideas and seeing how that develops. I just think there's value to that.
Fair enough.
I agree.
All right. And then, and GeoSam says, thanks for fielding this question. We appreciate you, GeoSam. GeoSam made my picture that I flaunt around. I get a lot of people asking me when I have it on TikTok, that's such a cool profile picture. And I'm like, it is. It really is. So there was one more. Here we go. Oh, no, there was 2 more. I'm sorry, Crystal. We'll get you right after this one. Joseph, I'm not going to say that. Question for both. Favorite book of the Bible and why?
I'm a bad Christian when I don't have an answer yet to this kind of question.
Yeah.
I don't know that I have. Huh?
I would say if it was fielded to me, I would probably take a very sarcastic approach at answering.
Yeah, that kind of thing.
But I'm gonna see how Cease answers this.
That's so hard to answer.
I wouldn't even know if I could, to be honest.
I don't even know if I can. To be
I'm not
honest.
saying it's all bad. It's just something where it's like the best. It's like I've never really thought about it, you know. So
Yeah, I haven't either. I mean, technically, the Bible is a book. I mean, I know I can't say that because it's
how many of them?
Wait, what do you mean?
How many books? And then
66. Oh, in the New Testament? Oh, okay, that I don't remember. I learned that a long time ago.
Guys, it's easy. It's a miracle. All you got to think about it is like this, right? So, what do you think of when you think of the New Testament? You think of the Trinity, right? Well, you don't really.
Okay.
I mean, you can as a Christian. Some people do. I would think you'd be ill-advised to actually. But people think of the Trinity, right? So 3 to the third power, 3 times 3 times 3 is 27. It's a miracle.
Whoa!
It's a part of Bart Ehrman's like debate speeches that he goes it's like part of it. I know it, but I didn't count the individual books of the Bible. But anyway, yeah, you guys got an answer?
I'll answer it this way. There are parts of the New Testament. I mean, again, I have a lot of moral issues with the New Testament, but there are parts of the New Testament where you get these people that are trying to trick Jesus by asking certain type of questions, and to see him sort of beautifully evade the questions asked. For example, when he tells, give to Caesar, what belongs, or give to I forget the exact quote.
I know you're talking,
but I forget who exactly is talking about now. It's been a while, but I like some of the ways in which he has an answer to at least what looks on paper to be trick questions. I mean, when I look at it at the Old Testament from an ironic point of view, some of the things that take place, I find, I mean, if you forget for a second how horrific it is, it's hilarious. I mean, the fact that he just sends bears to maul people, that, this whole idea that he sends himself to sort of fix and create a loophole that he established in the first place. There are just conceptual things that I just find amusing, just the destruction that you see in the Old Testament when you can kind of detach yourself from it. You can kind of observe it from a different, but I find it difficult to do that most of the time.
Sure,
I have to be in a very specific type of mood to be able to do that.
I know what my favorite quote is in the Bible, but it's not. It's actually a forgery. But it's the adulterer, the woman. Basically, everybody who's like, is it Hughes cast the first sin or throw the stone?
Oh, her.
Yeah. It's in every movie, like even.
Yeah, I mean that's a good one.
But it's apparently a forgery. So there's that. But anyway.
I'll say Acts. Because I remember I quote Paul a lot when I talk about stuff. So Acts is kind of along the lines of Paul. So I'll say Acts. Acts is my favorite book for now, because just based on what I remember about how much I talk about Paul. So
you say you had another question?
Yeah,
there was one left.
Last one from Crystal to David, fielding the best one for last.
Oh boy,
there is a point where the only reason I said this is because I saw the words evidence and logic. I didn't even.
Great question.
Do you think there's a point at which, where there could be an abundance of evidence or logic that would be that it would disprove or break your faith? Bear with me, guys. Eventually, I'll learn how to read.
It's okay. So the short answer is no. I believe that I have experienced God and that He has given me what is called the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit is the thing that is directly what. How do I phrase this? You could say He weighs on my conscience very heavily, but in a good way. And so it would be. I mean, the question for me, for you to understand it better, would be like saying, is there ever, do you think that there's ever any reason that anyone could ever convince you to divorce your loving husband? I think that the question assumes too much about what we're talking about. And I know that the dynamic is different. I know that, Mike probably wants to jump in here and say, but you can't see God. I can see my spouse. I'm sure that Mike really wants to jump in with something like that right now. But I believe that God exists in a similar fashion to where I know that, I was married, or I still technically am. So I think that the question is basically like asking, would you cheat on your husband or your wife? Like, could I ever convince you to do that? From my perspective, that's kind of what the question is. So that's why I say no.
Okay. Yeah, and I would.
By the way,
I would. Sorry, go ahead, Cease.
no, okay, that is a great question. And that's a question that I always ask theists when we have these conversations. And your answer, I mean, I understand you interpreted the question a little bit differently than obviously the way that I would see the question and what it means. But that answer is primarily why I have a problem with religion. This idea that no evidence can be brought to you to change your mind is the problem for me.
Can I? Okay, so well, not pushback, but can I respond to that real quick?
Yeah, of course.
Do you take the position that God could exist?
Yes.
Okay, so here's the difference. Then, from your perspective, from both your perspective and my perspective, you're not convinced that all of this component, that what I have already said that I have seen leads up to this thing called a rocket ship flying. That's where you're at. You're in the process of discovering how this thing works. I've already seen the thing fly. So from my perspective, I don't need to know how it works. I just know that it works. And so I understand where you're coming from. I'm just saying the fact that you don't know, or at least that you're not sure yet, just tells me that you haven't yet been, you haven't discovered what it is that I've already found,
Well,
so to speak.
Could I apply some pushback just real fast in that?
Sure.
To me, I would see how that would be the perspective, but I would kind of invoke what in philosophy of science, what you would call the underdetermination problem, where you might think that leads to that. But if we're going to use an analogy of there's something in the box and we don't know what's in the box, and you say it's like it's something that weighs 10 pounds, right? And you've gotten to that point. My problem is I'm looking at it going, well, I could literally say it could be something else that weighs 10 pounds, or I could invoke any type of, for example,
Right.
the other faith or any other, naturalistic pantheism is what some people, I guess, like to use as an example.
Right.
But I would use another faith for me. And for me, I just don't see how yours is any more determined than any rival theory I could come up with, just utilizing that problem of underdetermination. So from my perspective, it would be, if it was determined well enough, I feel like it'd be able to be demonstrated so that we wouldn't have this underdetermination issue.
And I'll add to that is I'll kind of respond with the same thing back at you, where, from my perspective, if you went through the same type of deconstruction of assumptions that I have, and understood what I understand about philosophy of mind and language and epistemology, and your journey was truly to seek truth, and I'm not saying that it's not, but I'm saying my feeling about theists is that usually they're projecting what they want to be true more so than what there is good reason to think is true. That I think you would say things differently. So yeah, it's the same thing. It's like if you knew what I knew, and you say, if I knew what you know, but yeah, okay, it's a difference in methodology.
I think I see what you're saying. Well, okay, so I
didn't mean to make you cry. I saw you took your glasses to make you
my
cry.
eyes itchy. No, well, actually, I'm going to change my answer because I think that this is actually kind of important, and this actually ties into. This can actually be a good ending for lead into next time. Because this is actually biblical, by the way.
Oh, that's
so
perfect, because I want to.
I know.
Have a biblical conversation with you.
Well, it's okay. Well, it's a little bit more of a because the position itself is a little bit less. What was the term that you said? Underdetermined. What was it?
It's called the underdetermination principle, or the problem of underdetermination.
Okay. So yeah. So you're making me, man, Mike, stop it, dude. You're making me like.
I just say the word.
Gosh,
You're like,
it's so mean. I'm never going to want to come back now. Okay, so since we're talking about the the resurrection next time, I actually would say so. Since I was just talking about Paul, Paul specifically said that if remember this is a guy who was an enemy of Christianity. He says that if he didn't actually see the resurrection, he just heard stories. He said if the resurrection never happened, then Christianity is false and Christians are to be paid above all men. So I will actually change my answer to that. If the resurrection can be proven as false, that's something that I guess would be a little bit more,
1 Corinthians 15, I think, right? Or something like that. Is that what you're saying?
I think so. I don't know. I think that would be probably a little more, because I would say, just from like right now, for example, we have Mike. I don't know how much you've seen of Michael's stuff, but he's shown that miracles are possible, at least now in today's society. And if miracles are even possible, then that opens doors for the past as to what the Bible claims about miracles happening and all that stuff. So to hopefully make it, a less underdeterministic position, I would say that the resurrection, and that's even what my Bible tells me to think. So,
yeah, and I think that's definitely a good segue for the next one, because I definitely want to have a more, I guess, no, I wouldn't say textual criticism or analysis, but I guess along those lines of it. But more so, I would like to have a conversation with you about just the reliability of the Gospels, essentially.
Right.
We could go into the resurrection or whatever, but yeah, is there any, before I close it out here, guys, is there anything that you guys want to kind of say, get off your mind, or?
Just thanks for having me here. I'm glad to see you starting your own thing, Mike, over here on your channel with
it's not even just me and Cease. It's me, Cease, Wes, and my buddy Max that I grew up with. But you'll see a combination of all of us around. So.
Okay, well, I figured there was more, but because I really only know you for the most part,
Sure,
I associate the whole thing with just you for now.
Sure.
But yeah, thanks for having me on, and Cease, thanks for having the conversation with me. Appreciate it.
Yeah,
thanks for the questions.
Thanks for coming on, and I hope you felt like you had time, good enough time to say everything you wanted to say. I hope I didn't hog the conversation too much.
No, I actually felt like I was the one hogging the conversation this time. So
it was pretty split. You guys, I liked the conversation because it was, for me, I would have to cut someone off early because I'd be like, it's too much information for me to remember unless I'm writing it down. But you guys did a really good job at letting that person go, biting your lip, and then responding, and then the same person reciprocating that. So I appreciate that as just a viewer. I think you guys were both good interlocutors.
I'll try and work on that.
For listening.
Yeah, and again, the next episode we will be me, Cease, and Max, I believe, breaking down some clips. I've been chatting back and forth with him on that, and I know that's kind of his bread and butter, and Cease knows bread and butter. If you haven't already, go subscribe to the Empathetic Atheist channel, the Atheist Roundtable, GeoSam. Go subscribe to everybody and anybody. I see Grumpy Old Cuss, all that. Apologies to Pasta Mike. We didn't have time to get you in. Hopefully we'll get you in next time. Aww. That said, guys, we love you. We hope to see you next time. Peace out.